The initial Pat Rabbit report in the middle 90s acknowledged that the community was at the heart of responding to the drugs crisis. And nothing has changed about that. That still holds true because nothing can happen without the community involvement. The consistent erosion of the community involvement, the fact that the community sector is treated with so little respect by the powers that be. Decisions are made on our behalf many times by civil servants who have no idea what a drug problem looks like, who've never been affected by it, who never had a family member addicted to drugs, who never had a family member die from an overdose, deliberate or otherwise. And yet they can decide, well, this is going to get cut and that is going to get cut. And the first thing that goes is that whole notion of community development. I heard this famous phrase about, it's important to maintain frontline services. And if all you do is maintain frontline services, all you have left is a line. You don't have a front line because you've got nothing at your back. And the thing that the community has always had at its back is the ability to be able to come together, talk about, analyse what it is going on in the community and develop responses. And that doesn't happen by osmosis. That takes resources. That's what's called networking. That's community development. And that's the bit that has been targeted, undermined, thrown out and poo-pooed basically by government. And if that bit isn't resourced and isn't maintained, there's nothing else coming up the line.
It's very important that in the drug situation that community development principles are held also. The task forces on their own right have done and are doing some good work, but they're doing so very much in isolation now. We do need to have an input from the community at all aspects and all levels in the process of dealing with the drugs problem. The current trend in drugs problems in the regions they really have developed a heroin problem, particularly large centres such as Waterford, Limerick, to a lesser extent Galway, which now has discovered that there's injecting heroin going on there, which up to quite recently hadn't been the case. Also at Lone, and the satellite towns or villages such as Thurles and Portlaoise and Roscrea are also affected by the heroin problem. The heroin problem is mainly dealt with through methadone maintenance. When people present for treatment, they're usually put on the methadone maintenance, and that's fine in the short term.
We were able to interview, I think it was over 700 school-going children in the area and a number of early school leavers. And that clearly showed the beginnings of a trend. And the trend is that people unfortunately have become addicted to heroin, by and large have remained addicted to heroin, and in some cases they've gone on to polydrug use. But the generation behind them are not in any significant number using heroin. What they're primarily using is alcohol and cannabis. The HSE in the Dublin North area has just completed a very good report which admits that the treatment services have been very much heroin focused, and then there's this urgent need to provide services, particularly to young people who have become addicted to alcohol or drugs of a non-heroin, non-opiate nature. And services have to be developed at local level that will help young people, particularly in the 15 to 25 age group, who find themselves chronically addicted to alcohol and cannabis and or cocaine, benzodiazepines, Nurofen Plus or Solpadeine. And I think there's an urgent need to recognise the emerging trends and for the services to be put in at a local level to help young people.
There hasn't been any real investment. What we have seen is a string of reductions, in particular I suppose from the community employment programme, the drug rehabilitation places. We had a decrease in the training budget over the last year. I think there was 50% cut, and I mean it's a key factor in terms of the rehabilitation and the recovery of young people. The training element is crucial in that care plan. And then of course, I mean the disability, the benefits that was cut, it created a barrier for young people coming on the drugs programme. It was a real fear, if they go on a programme, if they relapse, if they go back out, will they get a disability, will they have an income? And I suppose the reductions has also affected staff in terms of burnout, because we have, the emerging trends of drug culture has changed. In the past, we would have seen, a big increase in opioid users. The polydrug use is now cocaine, benzos, weed, and it brings its own problems. The treatment services obviously aren't adequately equipped to deal with it. You might see a drop in people attending for methadone programs, and obviously that gives the false conclusion that we don't have the big massive drug problem that we had in the past, but we do. You have young people coming to the project with their families, and the problem is increasing, but the resources are decreasing. So we don't have the tools there, and reductions have played a part in making sure people just they're not equipped to deal with the drugs problems in their local community. That voice has been taken away.
It was either heroin or drink. Throughout the 90s, maybe there was introduction of other tablets and certainly the arrival of methadone, which was a good thing. But the choices that a lot of our service users had to make were limited. They were narrower. This morning, I spoke with some of the women from Sale, and they were listing off all of the drugs that they could choose from. And they listed off Zimavane, Lyrica, Super Socks, the man-made substances or illegal made substances, white D10s coming in from England, ecstasy as blue ghosts, ketamine, snow blow, Xanax or Upjohns, a thing that they called blocks that they weren't too sure about, and that wasn't mentioning just crack, crystal meth, and then a re-emergence of tryptazole. And that's on top of the excessive alcohol use, and on top of the methadone, and on top of heroin. And it just feels now that you almost need a pharmacology degree in order to be able to work on the streets, because there's so much to choose from. You need to know all of the ins and outs of how these drugs, not only what they do, but how they work together. And the demands that are on our staff teams are increasing all the time because of the complications that come with the mixes and availabilities of drugs that are there. And that's working with the clients who actually make it as far as our services, because we don't have the resources to go out and meet all of the new users, all of the people who are drifting into drug use for 101 reasons, a lot of the time related to the fact that poverty is an ongoing issue that's getting worse and worse with the passing of every budget. And people are losing income on almost, it feels like weekly basis, so that they're not able to cope with all of the problems that are out there. And in so doing, they're using lots of drink, they're using lots of tablets, they're using lots of street drugs that are available. And the kind of issues that we find ourselves having to be expert on are things like deciding whether you can even talk to a client because of memory loss related to tablets they might have taken, issues of child protection, issues of domestic violence, issues of debt and intimidation, all on top of those kind of things of marginalisation that all go with drug use to begin with. So now, more than ever before, we've a space where you have to be expecting your staff to be experts at all of these levels, while the resources are being drained away and staff numbers are being reduced and more people are knocking at the door.
It's still a major problem. It's probably even a bigger problem now when you consider taking into account alcohol and what we've done with alcohol over the last 10 or 15 years. I think it's also very important to stress that, the problem as then 15 years ago is still concentrated in areas of disadvantage. So the poorest areas in our society, the poorest communities suffer the brunt of the drugs problem, be that the illegal drugs problem or the alcohol problem. I think that's undeniable. We've had evidence over the years about the number of people who end up in prison, the number of people who end up in treatment. Again, the vast proportion of people who are suffering in a very serious way, particularly from illegal drugs, are from poor, deprived communities. So any response has to be multifaceted, has to be interagency, has to be partnership-based. That was recognised in the earlier years of the National Drug Strategy. And the tragedy is that at a time when the problem facing the poorest communities in the society is still as bad, and in many ways worse, we are not now taking that partnership approach, that the National Drug Strategy is beginning to unravel. The very good interagency structures that we had developed, which were probably unique in Europe, involving the community sector, the voluntary sector and the state, those structures have, not gone away, but they've certainly been really seriously weakened. And there's a huge sense of frustration, disappointment and anger in communities. And instead of building on the strengths of what was a successful drugs policy, involving people in the poorest communities, involving citizens all over this country and in every county. Instead of building on what was working, we've let that unravel, and that's a real tragedy.